Hello and welcome to part 7 of our teacher series on how to run an amazing debating club, getting close to the end. So today we're going to talk about if you decide to get to the stage in your debate club when you want to actually run training sessions as opposed to just practice debates and attending competitions, but actual training sessions. Then we're going to talk about some training sessions you can run and how much debating knowledge you need to run each of these sessions, i.e., given your current level of debate knowledge, what types of training can you run and what types of training are you probably not able to run just yet. Common questions I get about training sessions are when should I start running them? As soon as possible. They are very useful. Should I wait until we know what competitions we're doing before we start training? No. And some schools do this where they sort of wait until there's a competition to train for, and then start training, which I just don't think is sensible. Ultimately, if you have a school football team, you don't wait until the league begins to start training. So I would start these lessons as soon as you feel you can. And I also wouldn't wait until you have 10, 12, 15, 20 hardcore committed kids. I would start them as soon as you think you can get 2 people through the door. And if you have them regularly, whether it's once a month, once a week, once a fortnight, regularly, same classroom, same day, same time, even if it is every other week, then that way kids know it's there if they want to start coming along. So there are 4 main lesson types, I think, when it comes to debate or public speaking training. So we're going to go through them one by one. The first one is drills. Now, drills can be run without that much debate knowledge from the teacher or coach, which I think means that pound for pound, they are probably the most valuable form of debate training because they can be run fairly easily, they can be adapted to the needs of students fairly easily, and they are very, very useful. So a drill is basically when you take a component part of debating or public speaking or giving a speech and practice that component part. Now, ideally, you're going to be able to notice the more and more that you watch your students debate at lunchtime or in competition or you hear feedback from judges, you're going to notice what your kids need practice on and adjust the drills accordingly. But this is just like when in basketball, for example, we don't just play games of basketball, right? We practice shooting, we stand in the 3-point line or whatever. We practice our jump shots, just 100 jump shots in a row, 200 jump shots in a row. We practice our dribbling, up and down the court, up and down the court. We practice passing or screens or whatever, so that we really get these things down. And then when it comes time to the game, it's easier to access them. This is the exact same idea. Now, some common drills that are useful. Matter generation. That just means coming up with points. So give your kids emotion and give them a time limit and say, okay, in alone, in 2s and 3s and 4s, whatever, you have to come up with 5 points, 10 points, as many points as you can, and they don't have to be detailed at all, just 10 ideas, or they have to be very detailed, adjust accordingly. Stakeholder analysis, coming up with different groups or people who are affected by emotion. Here's emotion, who's going to be affected by it? Come up with 5 groups and then rank them in order of importance. Old people, young people, the LGBT community, poor people, immigrants. I don't know what motion that is, but let's assume there's a motion where those are 5 groups that are going to be affected, and that the students not only have to pick out the different types of groups that might be affected, but who's most important or who's likely to be most affected. That's very useful for being persuasive. Chains of analysis. This is a drill whereby you give the students usually a motion or a starting point, like this house would do a thing, and then a consequence or point or effect. And then you get them to try and work on walking you step by step from the motion to the consequence rather than jumping or asserting. So, for example, if I was to say, I think I used this example in a previous video, if we legalize drugs, drug addiction would go down. And if you just say that, if we legalize drugs, we'll legalize drug addicts, that's not very persuasive. But you can walk me through that. So you can sort of say, okay, well, if we legalize drugs, one of the big things that happen is that people no longer have the social stigma or less social stigma of being drug addicts. They're no longer criminals and they're no longer likely to go to prison for consuming drugs because it's not illegal. The trifecta of these three things: reduce stigma, obviously stigma still exists, not having to fear prison, and not having to consort with criminals to get drugs, if drugs are not available in shops, means that people are overwhelmingly more likely to get help. What types of help are they likely to get? Well, they might, for example, and you go on through that explanation and eventually you get to the consequence, which is that you have less drug addicts. Impact lists. Give me 5 reasons I care about the consequence of the point. Why do I care if there's less drug addicts? PM, easy speech to practice in debating is always going to be Prime Minister, because you can just give kids a motion and say you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, then you have to give a PM speech. It's much harder to practice the 5th speech in a debate because you need the other 4. It's very easy to practice the first speech. Pointful, this is also called Pointastic, Lord of the Points, Lady of the Points. Essentially, each student is given 15 minutes to, or I mean, however long you want, a week, 5 minutes, to prepare a PM speech, and then they give that 5-minute PM speech, but they have to take 5 POIs from the class, and the classmates have to offer POIs. The point of that drill is obviously not to actually ever take 5 POIs in a speech. It's to practice giving POIs, accepting them, and responding to them. So those are some drills you can do. There are plenty more. It's just about finding component parts that students are struggling with and then drilling down on them. Discussions. Now, discussions are very, very useful training sessions. I think sometimes they don't really feel like training sessions, but they are. And I definitely think the more debate knowledge that you have and the more time you spend in the world of competitive oracy, the more pointed and useful these discussions are likely to become. But you can have discussions with your kids on debate things from week 1. You don't need a lot of debate knowledge. And these discussions can be, here's a motion I read about online. What do we think this debate is about? What's the most important point in this debate? What would we run? What points would we pick? Why those points? Who do we think are the most important people in this debate? If we were opening up, what would we anticipate another school would run in opening government? Those sorts of just open, free-form, chilled-out discussions can be really useful for kids and can be a little bit less intimidating and feel a little bit less like work. So that can also make it easier to get kids coming back. Similarly, post-ops can be quite useful, especially if you had a competition at the weekend and now you're at training, just having some discussions. Okay, what was hard about that competition? What was easy? What was our favourite part, our least favourite part? What feedback did we all get from the judges? Any common denominators? Any really useful feedback? Anything we learned? What was the best argument we heard? What was the worst argument we heard? Did we make any mistakes? What did we do well? Etc. These are useful lessons. Now, the third type is theory lessons. And theory lessons are things that you can't really do without debate knowledge. And there are organizations, debating organizations, public speaking organizations, that primarily, or at least partially, focus on giving teachers lesson plans. And the lesson plans that are drills are great most of the time. The lesson plans that are theory-based, I think, are disingenuous or dumb. And I've mentioned this before. I think that if you don't understand what framing is, you can't effectively teach a lesson on framing. And if you have to learn what framing is from a lesson plan and then teach it, it's a classic, like you're a probation teacher and you're like 1 week ahead of the kids working through the math textbook. It can be done. It can definitely be done, but it's not ideal, right? And I think that that's why in Standout Speaking, while we do provide lesson plans, we're much more interested on discussing with teachers and coaches how to amass more and more debate knowledge and how to become someone who doesn't need a lot of lesson plans because you know this stuff, or someone who could take these lesson plans and run with them very easily because you understand the subject very well and the lesson plans are just ideas, prompts, and pointers. The book that I wrote this year, that hopefully is coming out in 2021, about teaching debating, reflects this. There is a section that are just lesson plans or lesson ideas, but unlike some other Oracy project books, it's not just 200 pages of lesson plans, because I think that in order for that to be useful, you have to have a lot of debate knowledge. So a large part of what I wrote, and similar to the articles and the blogs that we often put on the website, is understanding the theory of debating. You know, what makes people better? What are common misconceptions? Where do they come from? How do we, why do we think about content and style in different ways? Are they not intrinsically linked? And why is one more important than the other at the beginning stage? How useful or how useless are rhetorical devices and why? I think that understanding this sort of stuff is imperative to being a good debate coach, and there's a lot to learn there before you can start teaching stuff. And I think that you'll pick up a lot of this stuff by going to competitions, watching your kids, and consuming content like this, and talking to people at competitions, other teachers, top debaters, judges, etc. But I don't think from the get-go that it would be a good idea for you as a teacher to try and find a lesson plan online from a company like ours. This has an hour lesson on uh, how to do great op whips, and like you have no idea how to op whip, and you're just kind of winging it. I think I would probably focus more on drills and discussions until you feel like you're teaching theory that you yourself are comfortable with. And lastly, knowledge sessions. I've discussed this before. I don't think that knowledge lessons are that useful, especially for novice and intermediate students. For advanced students, then they're already great debaters, so sure, if they have resounding gaps in their knowledge, then it might be worth filling them in. But the thing about novice and intermediate debaters is they're bad at debating. Uh, so like even if you give them all the knowledge in the world, they're still going to be bad at debating. And it's a lot easier to make them good at debating than it is to give them all the knowledge. So I would just focus on their debating skills. And one of the key ideas behind debating and public speaking is sounding more informed about a topic than you actually are. So the idea is that if you make someone a good public speaker or a good debater, they're able to sound like they know what they're talking about without that much knowledge. So in those circumstances, you don't actually need a lot of knowledge. So yeah, I don't really focus that much on knowledge with intermediate or beginner debaters. Similarly, I know that some coaches do this thing where they figure out on their circuit, in their geographical debate area, what are some commonly recurring motions, something like quotas or feminism, trade unions, something that comes up a lot. And then they just figure out what are the best 3 arguments for each side, and then explain them to their students and get their students to write them down and memorize them. And then their students are just prepared for those debates. I mean, if your only goal is your kids, while they are novices, to win some more debates as quickly as possible, then I guess it kind of works. But I don't think it's very useful from a broader educational perspective. And I think long term, they're not developing those skills and coming up with arguments when presented with motions they haven't seen before. And I would much rather that my novice students struggled to come up with arguments that I could have just given them, so that when they are advanced, they can respond and come up with arguments to things they've never seen or thought of before because they've developed those critical thinking skills. So I, as someone who is interested in the holistic educational development of my students, don't effectively give them the answers and have them memorize them. Some coaches do that and call it knowledge sessions. It's not for me, but you have to make your own judgment. And then lastly, I did say in the first slide, watching videos, and I just want to make clear why I sort of put that aside. I think that in general, lessons that involve you and your students watching some type of debate video and discussing it could come under discussions, whether that's you watching a very good debate and either discussing the debate or attempting to judge the debate. I think that can be useful. Watching an actual debate lesson with your students and going through it, again, I think that can be useful, and I would put that under discussions as a lesson type. I think that there isn't a lot of really high quality YouTube content for students yet, although I would fully expect that to change quite quickly, given how much easier it is to make decent quality YouTube videos nowadays and the sort of explosion in oracy organizations. What I want to say about this though is that in terms of watching videos, I don't think that watching great speeches makes novice or intermediate debaters better at public speaking. And I think that if you watch Dr. King and try to learn from him as a novice, I think that would be like me watching Champions League football and thinking that that's what's going to make me better at shooting a football, which I don't think it is. Now, watching great speeches as a novice public speaker can be very inspiring. It can make you want to do more debating and more public speaking. And so if you watch great speeches with your students and have discussions with them about them for the purposes of inspiration, I think that's awesome and a really useful lesson. But if you're watching, Julia Gillard's misogyny speech with your novice debaters and trying to learn from it via modeling, I don't think that works, both anecdotally, experientially, and just from a theory perspective. I don't think it's solid. I think it is much more solid with advanced speakers when they have enough knowledge of their own style that they can take component parts from a great speaker and utilize them. And that's when we start to use things like rhetorical devices and rhetorical techniques, like Dr. King using repetition, or indeed Julia Gillard using repetition. I was personally very offended, again and again. I think using those rhetorical devices, power of the, pacing, whatever, um, are things that confuse novices and hamper intermediates, and are only really useful for advanced speakers. So I wouldn't recommend watching great speeches for the purposes of improving your speaking as a lesson type. Cool. So that is the end of our lesson today, or our video, whatever we're calling these things. Next time we're going to do competitions 2. So last time we sort of talked about the value of competitions and why you should send your kids to competitions and how to think about competitions. Next time we're going to do kind of a run through of, okay, you're going to a BP competition next week. It's run by a university in the UK, what to expect, how to prepare your kids, and how to tell if you're at a good competition or a bad competition. I hope this was useful. This was definitely a long one, but I hope it was clear why we took a bit longer in this one. Um, because I think, debate training is so important, uh, but it is also just something a lot of people do wrong. So I hope this is really useful. As always, please give a comment below if you have anything you want to ask, or give us an email. Thumbs up the video if you liked it. It does really help. Share it with anyone you think might be interested if you want. And in the meantime, keep arguing with your kids, and we will see you soon. Take care.